Hello everyone, today we're going to continue focusing on carbohydrate metabolism. Last week we looked at glucose metabolism and today we're going to look at fructose metabolism. Now, fructose has been under a lot of scrutiny, so should you eat it or should you not eat it? And the answer is yes, of course you should eat it because it's part of the normal functioning of the body. It plays a role in energy generation, so in ATP generation. It helps you store food in the form of fats. It also helps with glycosylation. Glycosylation is a very important regulatory process within our cells. So to give you just one example, proteins, which are a string of amino acids, need to form a three-dimensional structure. And glycosylation plays a role in a lot of those proteins so that they can fold correctly. And now that's just one of the things that glycosylation is involved in. Now another different type of role that fructose plays is actually in fertility and men. So there is association with reduced fertility and men that have low fructose levels in the semen. The reason for this is that sperm like to use fructose as a fuel source so that they can travel through the uterus and the oviduct by moving their tail. So having said some physiological functions of fructose, now that's in concentrations that are reasonable, so by eating fruits. Now if you eat a lot of table sugar or products that have a lot of sugar, or high fructose corn syrup, which can have up to 65% fructose, then that is a completely different story. Since the introduction of sugar a few hundred years ago, where it was more readily available to individuals, there has been a steady increase in obesity, in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. In fact, there used to be a famous Roman chef who used to cook fatty liver, and his secret was to feed the geese dates which have a lot of fructose, and so the geese will develop fatty livers which would taste better when cooked because they had fat in them. So this association has been around for quite some time. In the 1960s, it was identified that those that had high fructose diets tended to have higher triglycerides in their blood. Now, let's have a look at what's happening to fructose at the cellular level and how potentially it could be causing an increase in triglycerides in the circulation. This is quite complex and is still under a lot of research, and so as a precautionary measure, whilst we're waiting for more research, I will reduce the consumption of sugar from your diet and high fructose corn syrup products until more is known, until it's known that it's safe and it doesn't cause fatty liver disease. So if, say, you had a soft drink which is 50% sugar, 50% glucose and 50% fructose, the concentration of fructose in the circulation would eventually be increased. It will then move into the liver cells, which is the main cell that processes fructose, and the reason for this is because of the transporters. It has GLUT2 transporters which fructose can utilize, and also it has the enzyme fructokinase, which is not in all the tissues of our body. It is in only a few tissues, one being the liver cells and another being the small intestine. And actually there is a correlation between the intake of fructose and a leaky gut because of the enzyme fructokinase being present there. And that is associated with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease as well. So fructose moves into the cell down its concentration gradient. Similar to glucose, it's phosphorylated by fructokinase. To fructose 1-phosphate. Now, if you look at glycolysis, which is here in the red box, there is no fructose 1-phosphate. It's actually fructose 6-phosphate that is the glycolytic product. And so it can't directly enter glycolysis at this stage. It needs further processing. So fructose 1-phosphate can be broken down into 2 molecules. One of those molecules is dihydroxyacetone phosphate, and which is a product of glycolysis. Now, fructose 6-phosphate, it's broken down in the glycolysis pathway. It's broken down into 2 molecules, and these are the 2 molecules that it gets broken down into. So dihydroxyacetone phosphate and glycerol-aldehyde 3-phosphate. Now, this one needs to have further undergo another reaction, which converts it to a second glycerol-aldehyde 3-phosphate group molecule, which can then be converted to pyruvate eventually. Okay, so the other molecule that is produced by aldolase B is glycerol-aldehyde. Glycerol-aldehyde is very similar to glycerol-aldehyde 3-phosphate. There's only a phosphate group difference. And in fact, that's what happens. It gets phosphorylated and then it can enter glycolysis. So this is how fructose can be processed to enter glycolysis and produce ATP. So let's imagine you've drunk your soft drink. Both glucose and fructose are coming into the cell. They're being processed. They enter glycolysis and they enter Krebs cycle. ATP is produced. It increases. ATP increases. Okay. The increase in ATP, when it is enough to fuel all the processes in the cells, it's high, inhibits glycolysis. So increase in ATP is going to inhibit the rate limiting enzyme of glycolysis. So glycolysis can no longer occur. Glucose cannot be converted to pyruvate to then enter the Krebs cycle to generate ATP. Instead, glucose is going to go and form glycogen so we can store it for later use. The problem with this, and this was what was thought to be causing the increase in triglycerides within the circulation, is that fructose bypasses the regulatory enzyme. So you can see that the products from glucose enter the glycolysis pathway after the regulatory enzyme. So that this will still be being processed and increasing ATP. Now, when there's an increase in ATP, there are enzymes that perform the Krebs cycle to generate the ATP that are actually inhibited. So what would happen is that you will actually get an increase in citrate. So this would increase, and citrate will be transported to the cytoplasm, and it will activate the enzyme that promotes fatty acid synthesis, acetyl-CoA carboxylase. And so you would form fatty acids, which could then form triglycerides, very low density lipoproteins, and be released into the circulation. They could then travel to adipocytes, fat cells, where they can be stored. If there's a lot of it being produced, then it would increase the concentration in the circulation. However, they thought that this might be the case, but it hadn't been completely proven. But what they have found as well is that only 1 to 3% of the fructose, after it was labeled, ended up as actually fat within our bodies. And so what that kind of suggested was that fructose wasn't actually being converted and to generate fatty acids. It was actually potentially stimulating an increase in the rate of lipogenesis. Okay, so, and what they think now might be happening is that Because this enzyme fructokinase is not regulated, what happens is all the fructose that comes in is phosphorylated. To do this, you're going to have to get the phosphate from somewhere. It gets it from ATP, so adenosine triphosphate. So 3 phosphate groups in adenosine triphosphate. So ATP comes in and ADP comes out. So diphosphate, adenosine diphosphate. Now this whole step uses up a lot of inorganic phosphate. So you end up with a reduction in inorganic phosphate. To generate ATP, you need to reverse this process. You need to convert ADP to ATP, and you need organic phosphate to do that. So if it's decreased, it's going to be harder for this to occur. So ATP is going to decrease. So it's not going to be increased anymore. And this is a temporary change. This is going to be activated. So glycolysis will begin again. At the same time, and I'm not putting all the steps, it's much more complex, you are going to end up with an increase in uric acid. The increase in uric acid is associated with gout. The other thing that uric acid is associated with and there's evidence for this, is that it affects the Krebs cycle. It inhibits some of the enzymes which allow for the progression of the Krebs cycle and actually promotes an increase in citrate. So now we're having glucose coming down through glycolysis, but it can't generate ATP because the enzymes through the Krebs cycle, one of them in particular, is inhibited. So where else is the citrate going to go? It's going to go down the fatty acid synthesis. The other thing that can happen to these products of fructose is that these two can be converted to glycerol. Glycerol is the backbone of the triglycerides. So 3 fatty acids will attach to glycerol to form the triglycerides. So these could potentially be feeding into that to form those triglycerides. The other thing that could be happening is because there's so much coming through here and not being processed through the Krebs cycle and glycolysis is not being inhibited, is that some pyruvate could be converted to lactate. Which is what happens in the absence of oxygen usually. Lactate, and both lactate and glycerol actually can enter what is known as gluconeogenesis, which is the generation of glucose from amino acids and glycerol and lactate. So it could potentially end up as glucose as well. So it is not completely, and of course there's other regulatory factors such as hormones and other factors that are going to affect this whole process. So it's very simplified, but it's just to give you an idea of what is the most likely thing that at the moment appears to be happening according to the literature. And so I guess the take-home message is that until there is more evidence or more research done that is more conclusive as to exactly what high levels of fructose do within the body, it is probably wise to just stick to eating fruits and only eat small amounts of simple sugars and high fructose corn syrup products. And I think that's all I will say for today, and I'll see you next week.
And don't forget to like and subscribe down below.